Well, we've got 2 weeks left in our study. It's been to me a very fascinating approach, and as I talk to some people who professionally more study our Bible, study our scriptures, say that the way that we have approached Romans is a way that we probably ought to approach a lot of the books. You kind of start at the back. You start where the salutations and the welcomes are, but you kind of start to get into what the book was all about. We're going to do a quick review, and then we're going to kind of shift back toward the front of the book now. And hopefully, as a group of adults, we can kind of use our own experiences and draw some conclusions from that apply to us today as much as it did back to the Roman Christians. All right, what was the occasion of the letter? Why was Paul writing to the Roman Christians?
To create unity.
What?
To create unity.
Create unity. Why was there not unity? They were all Christians.
Different background.
All right.
How about today?
Different background. What was the background?
Well, some were Gentiles and others were Jews.
All right. There was a group of Jewish Christians. There was a group of non-Jewish Christians. So there were the Jewish Christians and there were us. And what was the issue? They were both Christians. Did we not cover that very well?
Different beliefs and lifestyles.
Different beliefs and lifestyle.
Who more religious than you are?
You're more religious than I, or the Jews are both. Or the Jews are more religious. The Jews thought they were more religious. Why did they think that?
So they kept the law.
The Jews had been given the law. Now, we're going to come back to that and hit it hard today. If you remember as we worked through those last few chapters, Paul's conclusion of what he wanted to see happen to the Roman Christians was that they put aside their differences. He said, at the end of the day, you guys, you're siblings. And so when Phoebe is going from church house to church house, when she goes to Usman's churches, she's talking about the fact that you guys are politically more powerful, have more prestige than your Jewish Christian friends. But you're lording it over them. You demean them. You make fun of them. You don't respect them. And then when she went into the Jewish church homes, she's saying, why do you continue to use the Torah and hold that as the essence of your Christianity, with Jesus just that last checkbox? We got the Messiah. Why do you cast judgment on your non-Jewish friends? One group disdains the other one has no respect and judges the others as being less than they are. Now, we got to the conclusion already. Paul said, I want you to be transforming yourself into Christ. We haven't used the word Christoform in here yet, but it's there. If you go back and read some of the studies of Romans, that's a common phrase that's there. Christoform means I am going to start forming myself like Christ. Very consistent with what David preached about this morning. But at the end of it, he says, I want you to have hope and peace, as Tina finished off her segment this morning. But I also want there to be love with each other. And so Phoebe is trying to glue all of this back together. So we know who was there. We know what Paul's conclusions are for them. And in the last 2 weeks we have, now we're going to go back to the beginning. And Paul's going to start to talk to the Jews and the non-Jews and help them understand better what their relationship is with each other. More importantly, what is their relationship with God? I've got the first 4 chapters today. Paul's going to start off talking about God and his relationship with mankind in general. And then we're going to focus on the Jewish Christians. Really powerful. And then Jack will finish off what we concluded last week, finishing any thoughts we have there, talking about our relationship with Jesus and with God. And then we bring everything to a close. So in these chapters, it starts off, and Paul is talking about mankind. And he's talking about the fact that as time has gone on, there have been people who understood what it was to have God, who tried to live their lives orderly, both Jew and non-Jew, trying to live their lives for God, for his laws. But there were also a lot of people who disdained that and turned to evil and did evil things. The world became full of evil. And God said, okay, if that's the direction you want to go, I'm not going to stop you. Free will is tough because you get to make a decision. And God says, you made your decision. So in the first part, he's talking about all of us. And then he turns to the Jewish people, the Jewish Christians. Now, apparently there may be one Jewish Christian who's really taken all of this hard and is judging, kind of serving as the overall judge. I know you can imagine that knowing the Pharisees, but imagine one of the Jewish Christians who's kind of standing up, representing the group, and saying, this is the judgment that I cast on the non-Jews. And he's mad at Paul. He says, we're God's chosen people. And he quotes Deuteronomy 23, where God says, and out of all of the people, the Jews are going to be my portion. They are my people. We belong to God. And by the way, God gave us the law, the oracles, and he also gave us faithfulness from him. Now, the Hebrew word there is hesed. It is a steadfast love that God has for people that will never go away no matter what. And the Jews say, we've got all of this. So we have a distinct privilege over those of you who never were under a law in the first place. We've been following this law for thousands of years. We are in like flint. And they're boasting about it. And why not? They've been doing it right. The Gentiles haven't even had a religion to fall back on that had God in the center of it. And so they're boasting to each other and to the non-Jews about how superior they are. And then they go even further and said, look at our track record. We've got Abraham. We've got Isaac, Jacob. We've got David. Look at our long stories. Look at the value system that we have promulgated and brought forward. Here's our lineup. Non-Jews, what's yours? And I could just see Paul rolling up his sleeves and saying, you ready to take me on? Because I'll do it. Now, worried more about Phoebe, because I don't think Phoebe was rolling up her sleeves. She was trying to tell this story and make sure that the judgmental Jewish Christians understood all this. Now, these people are mad at Paul because Paul says there are other people going to heaven besides you. Now, I made that statement. We're going to continue on in a minute. But one of the things that I enjoy about adult education is presenting a point, presenting an idea, and then letting the people in the room, the adults who are living life and have had experiences and have perceptions, carry on as part of that conversation at that point. You become co-teachers with me. And when I say we're the only ones going to heaven, I hope that struck a chord with you a little bit. We're going to come back to the Pharisees in a second. But I hope that struck a chord with you. Because they said, if the non-Jews are also going to be chosen people, then what happened to the faithfulness that we had? And if God gave us the law, and we've been following that law for thousands of years, where's God's faithfulness to all of this? And what Paul is going to say here, he's going to say, you bet God's faithful. He's proven it. God's not the one that screwed up here. You are the ones who screwed up. In this great big beautiful tree that's the kingdom of God, here you guys were, and there are a number of Jewish people who didn't accept the Messiah, or they accepted the Messiah only as the final checkbox, and Paul says they're being cut off. Now you've got this promise down here, the root system down here, that says that these are God's people, but you can screw it up. If you don't accept the Messiah, and as importantly, the teachings of the Messiah, you're going to be cut off. And you know what? In God's original plan, there's a group of people who want to be on this tree. And so they're going to be grafted on the very root system that you were a part of. So the issue is here, God's been faithful, you haven't. And let's talk about these laws. Laws are there for a reason. They kind of demonstrate what God expects his people to do. And so Paul says, okay, follow the oracles. Have you done that? Have you done every bit of it?
Wow.
I mean, the history of the Israelite, the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah shows the exact opposite.
Build up on that while I shoot.
Well, you look at the history of the Old Testament. At first, you see the following Moses. God says, I didn't choose you because you're super faithful, or you're super righteous over everyone else. I choose you because I promised Jacob, and I promised Isaiah. And he goes, and you see all through the exile, the 40 years of the wandering. It was because of, well, he's been running 40 years because of faithfulness. And God said, I chose you not because you're super righteous, because of the unrighteousness of the Canaanites, and because of my promise to Abraham and to Isaiah and to Jacob. You see the kingdom, you see the Judges. Judges is very, very frustrating to read because God will appoint a leader, will save Israel. Israel will be saved, and go back to following the other gods. Before that, they'd be conquered. They'd ask for God's help again, God would come again, and it continues to cycle that. You see the kingdom period. You see Saul who chose not to obey God and fell. You see David obeyed God mostly. Then Solomon came, given all the wisdom of the world, he fell away from God. He chose paganism. And then the idea of the kingdom split. And you see all through time, the kingdom of Israel just fell completely apart. In Judah, they'd have times where the king would follow God, and then right after the son would leave. And then I forget which one it was that started human sacrifice that started in Israel. So there was human sacrifice all through Judah and Israel. It fell apart, and then God brought him back to Israel after the exile. And then they started following tradition over the law, as the Pharisees were known for. And again, they fall apart, and they wouldn't accept Christ. You see consistent failure and then growing back. So that both.
I think we know we've in our own studies, and thank you for bringing it to our attention right now. The failure, the embrace of God, the forgetting of God, and what he wants for them. The pain, and then the coming back, and the hugging, and the kissing, and then they mess up again. Over and over and over again. And part of what I want us to think as we go through the rest of the class is, where are we today on this?
Same thing.
I remember growing up as a child, and this was, I grew up in the 50s, in the heyday of the explosion of the Church of Christ. I remember with great pride looking at the census that showed that the Church of Christ was the fastest growing religion in America. And I loved my parents. They were devout followers of Christ. But boy, they were devout followers of the Church of Christ of the 1930s and 1940s. Which said the idea is not so much how we get along with each other and let's do things that keep us from dividing, but what will make us a distinct and separate people inside a fence because we know we're doing it all right. It's exactly what the Jews were thinking. Here is the fence we're going to be in, and as long as we're in this fence, we are okay with God.
My parents were identical, evidently, to yours. My father was an elder. They were very faithful, very, very conservative.
Can y'all hear? I want to make everybody can hear.
Okay. My parents were very similar. I may be wrong, because they were so faithful to their conscience and to their beliefs, I believe they'll be in heaven with us. Okay, even though they didn't put the proper amount of emphasis on grace, okay, that's my feeling. You want to repeat that?
Yeah, he says, although he said his parents were like mine. It wasn't just my parents, it was everybody I knew was like that. We're not about to judge it because in this section, by the way, God's going to come back and Paul's going to come back and talk about God and said, it's God's righteousness. God's going to determine who's right or not us. And if we have someone who lived different, my concern is, what are my grandchildren going to think about me right now? When they mature their Christianity, because you believe that granddaddy thought this and thought this was important, we're all fall in that category. And Paul is saying in this, at the end of the day, you guys, your attempts to follow this law proved fruitless because you couldn't do it. Now, if you could have done it, great. But you didn't. Just like the Church of Christ that we're in now. And last week we brought up a whole lot of other issues. Mary, just a second, I'm going to come to you. We brought up multiple circumstances. We talked about some of the racial issues that have gone on, the political separations that have gone on. We've talked about some of the socioeconomic things that have gone on, the political, the nationalism type things that have gone on within our church and our country. And we recognize all of those as divisive. And today I want us to come back and talk about how we as this church family don't go down that road. Mary?
One of the things that brings to mind is the upbringing. I remember watching a film, the one with the reel, and the title of it was The 3 Minutes After. And there was a mother hanging up clothes on a line. And then there was a bright light, and then she looked down and her child was gone, which gave the illusion her child went to heaven and she was stuck. And then the next one you saw, on the next reel, you saw fire. And then these people gashing their teeth. And that scared me into being baptized because I didn't want to have that 3 seconds on my end.
That's just what God wanted, Mary.
So once I learned, and I grew up under the hellfire and brimstone, we're the only one. Once I began to learn, and I remember we had a gospel meeting, and Brother Reginald Dooling preached from John 10:16. There are sheep that are not of this fold. You have nothing to do with the gathering. That's why he said, you don't separate the wheat. That's not your job. Once I learned that, I then began to be more open to when I would have conversations with my classmates and they were Muslim or Methodist or whatever it was that they were. The Bible that they were using was the exact same Bible I was reading out of. There are some things that are absolutely immutable. Jesus is Lord. He died for all of our sins. He was raised from the dead. I'm not going to follow Methuselah because if you go, the Muslim guy, I'm not going to follow the Muslim guy because if you go to the grave where Muhammad is at, his remains are still there. If you go to where Jesus is laid, he's not there. So that there are some immutable things. The instruments of music and worship is immutable, God has said, but the order of things that we do, those are, and that's one of the reasons why some churches of Christ fall out. We got one cup, y'all got multiple cups. We got a kitchen in our church, y'all don't have a kitchen in our church. I mean, it's idiotic, but once again, there are sheep that are not of this fold. So who am I to tell someone who loves God as much as I love God that they're not going to heaven? That's not a job that I have. What I can do is love them, just like the Ethiopian eunuch and Philip. Love them where they are. And if I think I have what's right, keep doing what's right. And at the end, God will separate. And I think we get hung up on that. Your family's not circumcised, mine is. Well, how do you know your granddad was circumcised? You only heard it, you weren't there. So how do you actually know that it happened? There are sheep that are not of this fold. And once we learn to love like God loved, looking past our own eyes, I believe that universal faithfulness will show up and it will literally shock us. It will, because we'll be able to look at people who don't look like us, talk like us, smell like us, feel like us. We'll be able to look at them and go, you are a creature of God.
All right, that's your lesson for today. Let's go get our coffee early. So, what Paul is saying here, this is wonderful, but you can't follow it. I'm faithful. You haven't been faithful to your side of the promise. You have no reason to be boasting because you have failed miserably. And yes, hooray for Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, all of those, but they're not the ones that are going to get you righteous with God.
To Mary's point, I think Paul is a very clear, very easy guidance of what it takes to be a Christian church. That was Romans 10:9, which is praise God, praise God as Jesus is Lord, as your voice, and believe He rose from the dead by God. And we get Romans 10:9 real quick. But that is a very simple, a very clear consideration. That's all. That's the general basic. Very good. But what does it say? That the word is near you in your mouth and your heart. That's the word of faith thing. Because you confess in your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised from the dead, you will be saved. Heart one believes and justified, and mouth one confession and saved. So I think that right there is the basic ground that we all agree on. That's sort of the, hey, if you believe this, that's what we can agree on.
And I hope you've all got that scripture down. It was interesting as I was reading through this, I thought, man, how many generations of Christians have read through this and pick out the parts that they wanted. Pick out the part about accepting Jesus to be saved. And there are different interpretations on that. Our Baptist friends say, once you're saved, you're always saved, which to the Church of Christ was totally different. Because you could sin, and if you died right at that moment, you were gone. There was no grace that covered it. And so we had that conversation with him. It's comforting this week. It's like Father says, it's a very comforting concept, but it's not Christianity. In fact, that once you accepted Christ, you went to heaven. That was the kind of stuff that we dealt with at that time. But what he's telling, that the Jews are saying, I don't need Jesus other than to check the box. What did they not understand?
That he was changed. The law was for them to learn about God and discipline. And until Jesus came, because they always had to roll their sins forward. They couldn't do it perfectly. So it took Jesus to take care of the sin problem. And God told about that. He was faithful. he told them about that. And it took Jesus. They needed Jesus as their Messiah, their Savior. And that put heart into the law. He brought the heart, and then the law became the law of the heart, what Jesus spoke.
And I hope I'll be heard, Linda. She's saying they needed Jesus, not as a checkbox, but as the individual, the God who was trying to cover their sins up, that they had failed so miserably on. And our Jewish friends didn't think they needed that. Just think about the Pharisees for a minute. That's who you hold up as the. And someone told me the other day that the Mercedes was the Cadillac of automobiles, which I thought was very interesting concept. But they're kind of held up. This is our shining example. These are people totally devoted to the Word. They hold the Scriptures as inspiration. They read it. They memorize it. They follow it. They put into the plate even to the 10th of their mint and their time being given to the synagogue. They separate themselves out as much as they can. They don't want to touch evil. They don't want to touch those things out there that are considered unclean or dirty. They train their children from early on. They have schools, fabulous schools at the synagogue, that train their children in the way that they should grow, so when they're old they will not depart from it. They honor God every day in their lives. They pray multiple times a day. Does that sound familiar? It's the way I was raised. Paul says you can't get there that way. The Pharisees did not accept Jesus because they didn't think they needed Jesus. They were God's people. And I know, growing up in the church, and I'm going to apply other things as well, the nationalism, the racialism, the other things that we're fighting with right now, people are saying, I'm not the one that needs this. I'm a baptized believer. And what Paul is saying here, there's a lot more to it than that. Mary, another comment.
Well, I just want to add on the end of what you indicated when you read out of Romans 10 is that to go further and add to that, because that's where the world stops. And if I hear it and I believe it, I'm good. But you have to be baptized. So that's one of those other immutable things. And so, as it talks about in Romans 6, you can hear, you can believe, you can confess it. That only puts you up to. You can go up to a house and it's cold outside. If you never go into the house, you remain cold. And the door is unlocked, so we have to have that immutable fact of baptism.
I think that it doesn't make any difference if you're talking about religion or education or anything else. As humans, we pick our point where we think we have reached the pinnacle. And we stay there until something knocks us off. And then we find a new pinnacle. And that's a part of how we just experience things. What happens is when we are knocked off by God and we don't get back up. And that's where you get stuck. Because you've already made your mind up that you have reached the ultimate, and therefore it doesn't make any difference what things are flashing in front of your eyes, what you're seeing, what you should be responding to. You turn that off because you have already decided that you have reached the ultimate. And we need to be able to not close our eyes off to what's around us so that we can see when God's giving us something to move.
So when we're feeling comfortable on our pinnacle, that's when we look at. Comment over here.
One of the things to remember when Paul talks about Jewish Christians in Rome is he's not talking about the Jews that are going to synagogue on Saturday. He's not talking about the Jews who still worship at the temple when he's writing it. The temple's still around, and there are Jews that are going there every single day. He's talking about Jewish Christians. And by the way, some of the Pharisees became Christian. Okay? So this is not a polemic against Jews necessarily. This is a discussion of Jewish Christians and how they interrelate with Gentile Christians. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so the broader question of whether or not Jews are justified by their lineage or by their temple or by whatever is kind of irrelevant to what Paul's addressing. Paul's addressing Jewish Christians who have accepted Jesus as the Messiah of Israel, and the resultant clash between them and the Gentiles.
Jim, you said kind of relevant. It's more than kind of relevant. It is a situation. You can't rely on what you've had before. You've got to rely on being what it takes to be a Christian at this point. The rest that's worthless now.
I just want to say it occurred to me that this letter, it seems like it was successful. If they actually did, I'm sure continue to have their problems, but the Roman Church is the reason why we're together in this room right now. Because the Roman civilization spread Christianity. As brutal of a civilization as that was, Christianity piggybacked, stowed away. And our culture today is very much like a violent culture too, and self-serving like the Roman civilization. And but our faith is still alive, and we still come together, like Paul was telling them to do. And so it seems like they did manage to come together. And this letter might have changed history to the point where that's why we're together right now, because they heard those words. And it got into their mind and their practice to not judge each other. And
Jack made the point a while back that the central conflict of the church, of Christianity, between the time where Jesus was resurrected and going forward, is, for a couple centuries at least, is this clash between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. And that doesn't resolve itself even after the fall of Jerusalem and the sacking of the temple. That resolves itself further down the road. But this is the central clash. This is the central clash, central issue of Christianity in the first couple of centuries. And he's totally right about that.
There were enough people to come together to say, okay, and even to the point of being sacrificed in the Colosseum, being that Christ-like.
Well, that many years in the future that started happening.
Yeah. And that influenced the Roman culture so much, whoa, that's humbling. They're willing to go and die, and it did, it conquered the conquerors.
Courtney, you have not been here for all of it, but one of the things that we want to make sure that we discussed was, of all the letters that were written by the elders and church leaders, most of them we've lost. Romans we didn't lose. Why is Romans still in a fight? And I think that a lot of what you say here is that there's a historical significance to us that we can't lose because there was a triumph that came.
Yeah, I was just going back on what was said over all this on the road, is that this was, I believe, a unique group of Christians that Paul was addressing, and I'm going from memory, but in the first chapter, I do believe he treated the introduction a little differently than he did with most of his other letters, and that he called them fellow evangelists, et cetera, et cetera. It makes me wonder if these weren't Jewish people who were at the day of Pentecost and left because they came into Jerusalem, for the Passover. Some of them who were very devout would stay till Pentecost, and then was in a group of those who then went back to Rome and founded. Because I don't think, you will correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think any of the apostles actually established the church in Rome, which I think is probably the only one that wasn't established that we know of major. So I think it was a different group of people that he was addressing. And he was very cautious, not to try to offend them in chapter 1. Okay, I'm not saying that I was wrong.
You and I read that differently. I think he was splitting them up. But maybe he was trying to be really nice to them at that point. Remember also that...
Well, don't you think he was upset with them? I mean, they were upset with him because he didn't go to the Gentiles and did not come to them.
Oh.
We are the chosen one, and you've neglected us. Because Paul apologized basically, I wanted to come see you, but I wasn't allowed to.
But remember that and I don't think it was doubt that a lot of these made it down at the day of Pentecost. They moved to Rome, then they got kicked. The church started, and they got kicked out. The Jews got kicked out. So it became us Christians there, the Gentile Christians, who grew the church, not using the law as our framework. So when the Jewish people came back, it was not the same church that they had grown up in. And so this is where that tension is they're Christians, but they want to follow something a little bit differently. And I still in my mind feel like that there was a falling back on the faith of being a Jew that was going to be their, at the end of the day, their solution. And what Paul's trying to make sure they know is, no, if you want the righteousness of God, you have to accept Jesus. You have to start to transform your life. As I worked through this, you guys, I grew up thinking that hear, believe, confess, be baptized, and then obey. They were all, you had to do every one of those. I know there's been a shift over the last couple of decades to try to separate salvation and works. And I see that point very much. But if you read what we've got in here, Paul says there's some works that you demonstrate because of your faith. Mm-hmm. And if you don't show those works, by the way, James is going to take that later on as well. Do you understand what you did when you accepted Jesus?
I think salvation works. I mean, it's not as divided. I think true salvation, truly accepting Christ, will create a desire for works. You do works to be saved. You do works because you are saved. So you see, John talks about all the time that if you truly love God, you have to love your neighbors. If you don't love your neighbors, well, you probably never truly love God in the first place. If you didn't love your brothers that you see, how can you say you love God if you never seen? For God is love. Again, I'm going to see a bit of this reverses there, but in truth, the salvation creates a desire for grace. Grace creates a desire for works. You do works because you're saved. You run a marathon because you're fit. You're not running a marathon to be fit. That's probably a bad idea. You run a marathon because you're fit. You do these events because you're saved. You do your works because you have the grace.
Paul goes so far when he's talking about faith. And he goes back and he says, all right, we bring up Abraham. He's the star of the show here. When did God accept him as righteousness? When he was circumcised? Or was it when he accepted God as his father?
God is.
What about the works? It was about the faith that came first. Now, the whole concept here of obedience to the faith is something I think at some point we need to have more discussion about it. And we may let Jack Reese help us get through that at that time. But I do think you're starting to get the concept of where we are. And I want us to stop and say, when we feel like we're on the pinnacle, and we see members of our church family who are unwilling to be open to people who have some differences of opinion on certain matters, a number on it. We lost church families over the last couple of years for various reasons. But some of those, in fact, that as we were reading the scripture and trying to understand what Paul was writing, that there were some gender adjustments that we needed to make. And there was a group of people who said, this is not the way I was raised, and I am not comfortable with this, and I'm leaving this family. I'm leaving this body. And we're going to have some things that we talked about. We're getting ready to start some studies on racism, racial issues. There are going to be some others that I am sure in the next couple of years, because you can't look at what happened nationally and not see it. Some of the political national stuff that's going to be going on that members of our church family feel very strongly about. And whether they're going to be able to say, I'm going to push the nationalism out of the way. I'm going to push that concept out of the way so that I can stay focused on being loving and caring in my family. That's what I need to do.
I want to do a little testimony about Old Testament thing. When I was younger, I have a good feeling. Just graduating high school, I thought I knew everything about God. I knew better than the pastors, I knew better than anyone else, so I stopped going to church. I stopped going for about 15 years. I stopped going to church. I stopped following, and I thought, okay, I'm confirmed. My faith from here started going down, down, down. I started falling away. And it wasn't until last year, a little before, a few years ago, I started going, wait, I need to go back to read the Bible. And then, okay, I read the Bible, so I don't need to go to church. I'm reading the Bible. I'm good. And then, about a year ago, December, it hit me all at once. Everything fell apart. I sat down and go, do I really call myself a Christian anymore? Do I really believe this? And I had to sit down, and I had a huge spiritual crisis in my life. And it was distraught. I called my chaplain. I called my chaplain I served in the army with. They called me, hey, I need help. I'm lost. He brought me back, and I started going, well, maybe I start watching the church over the internet. Start watching videos. I can do it anytime. And, the reason I'm not going to church is not because it's because I didn't want to go. And the reason I didn't want to go is because it wasn't because I was better. I just made excuses in my life why I didn't go. Kept making excuses. So I started going December of last year, and I thought, well, I didn't get baptized. I didn't need to get baptized. And I was, wait, why did I want to do it? Why is this? It was not because I was any better. I just didn't feel like it. And I realized I needed to do it. So I got baptized to follow Christ's example. And it was taking me down, and taking the pinnacle, falling off the pinnacle, it got me back to being, trying to worship God again, trying to get better, trying to learn. And again, realizing that the pride has to go away. And that's kind of the whole thing. I felt that's kind of cool.
There's a wonderful place for testimonials. We don't do that enough. Thank you for that. As we move forward, I want to go back to the comment that Courtney made a while ago, because why was this book left forward? Why did it get protected by the Roman Empire for so long, and then the Roman Church, who began to make changes in it and began to apply their own works that had to take place to be saved? And by the way, if you had violated any of those sins without getting a confession of your sins to the priest, you were also gone. So much that by the 14 and 1500s, the priests were wealthy because people would give them money in order to make sure that their prayers had gone up and they were protected. We had a chance to go to Wittenberg about 3 years ago, where Martin Luther was, and actually saw the door. They got it up, barely see it because they're trying to protect it. But he's talking of it in his discussion. He's a priest, and he's starting to see these things called writs of indulgence. And most of you may know what this is, some of you may not. In the Catholic faith at that time, the bishops had it fixed that if you thought there was a possibility that you were going to have a wild time Saturday night and not obey God's laws, that you could go to the priest in advance and for a sum of money get a certificate that says get out of jail free. Okay? That's what the writ of indulgence was. We actually saw those in the Wittenberg museums. And Martin Luther was a strange guy, and we can have conversations about him later, but he was a priest who wanted to do what God wanted to do. And he picked Romans. And as he worked through Romans, he said, the Catholic Church has this all wrong. We go to heaven by grace, not by works. And that changes where we are today. Now, I don't know how we'll finish off as we move into new classes, but I hope this group of people begins to look and see where we are on the pinnacle, where we need to be as this church family moves forward, if we're going to do acts of service, if we're going to be transformed into Jesus, if we're going to accept the diversity of his creation, what is our role in that? And Jack will close us out next week on us, not the Jews, but on us. Mary, one last thought before we go.
One of the things that impresses me and that sinks with me with Romans is that Paul was one of them. So the slick thinking of people who try to use other way out things, he had already done it. He had already searched out Christians because he was a Roman citizen. So he knew the foundation of why they thought the way that they thought. His pinnacle moment on the road to Damascus is what unearthed him. And from that point forward, he was learning from a different angle. And I love it the way that when people would, on his journey, when they would say things or do things, he would just come back as a Roman, but quicker. He would come back as a Roman, but with more love. That sometimes, I remember when I was in counseling once, the therapist said, "You're not finished being angry. That's why you can't let this go." And I thought, well, I should be able to let it go. You should, but you're not finished being angry. The moment that you're through being angry, you'll let it go. The moment that the Romans were through being superior, they can let it go. They weren't finished.
That's excellent. All right, let's close with a prayer as we go through this next week. Father, thank you for letting us be here today. As we join our Christian brothers and sisters around the world, all meaning because we believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Pray that we will put all of our faith in that relationship, that we'll be so full of joy and gratitude and peace that we will become your son in this world, that we will serve, that we will embrace the diversity of your creation completely. Be with us this week, Father. Help us to reflect you. Through your Son, we pray.